Hey there, everyone. So today we're going to actually dive into genetic inheritance. And so we're going to start by talking about the most basic type of inheritance, which is what we call Mendelian. But yeah, that's what we're doing today. So just to kind of review what we were talking about before, we know that genes are what carry the information, right? Genes are located in your DNA. Oh, we're skipping ahead here. Traits are what those genes actually look like on the surface, so how they manifest. So traits are your visible characteristics. And by visible, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can see it by looking at someone. It might be something like the shape of a kidney, right? We can't really see a kidney from the outside, but it's there, right? It manifests. So things like eye color, right? The color of your eyes. Things like hair color, right? Things like presence of hair on your fingers. The hitchhiker's thumb. So those are all examples of traits that are determined by your genes, right? They're your visible characteristics. So your genes are located in the DNA, right? So in your nucleus of every single cell in your body, you have a full set of DNA, right? Every single cell in your body carries your DNA. In there, you have a set of chromosomes. And chromosomes have kind of this X shape. And that's because technically, they are two parts that are connected in the middle. Now, in this chromosome, if we were to zoom in on a single section, is this big winding complex of genes, or of DNA, sorry. And so this whole thing is one big giant strand of DNA, but the different sections, remember, would start with a start codon, end with an end codon. And within that gene, there's the information to make a specific protein. So the genes come in pairs, right? So we've got one on this side, and we've got one on this side. This would be a pair. The reason that your chromosomes are made of two parts is because we get them from two different spots, right? We get one side from your biological mother, and you get the other side, I guess we'll use from your biological father. So you get one from your biological mother, and you get the other side from your biological father. So what that means is for every gene, for every protein in your body, you actually have two sets of DNA. So you have two sets of what that trait could look like. So in our cells, so this actually over here is what we call a karyotype. And so what a karyotype is it's a visual representation of all of your chromosomes, like what your chromosomes actually look like if we zoom in on your cells. Now notice that every single one has two copies, right? And you'll notice that even in these images, you can see those bands, right? Every band that you see there is a gene, right? So it's a set of coding DNA that will produce a protein. And so that exists for every single one. So you have 22, and then your 23rd chromosome is your X and Y. So this is actually a male. And we know that because of that Y chromosome, right? If this was a female, they would have two X's. And those chromosomes look different. The Y chromosome is actually significantly smaller than the X chromosome. We'll talk about that later. But that's an important thing to keep in mind. So for every single one of these chromosomes, you get one from the mother and one from the father. Right? And so remember that your mother and father also each had two. So they donate half of their DNA to you. So Gregor Mendel was one of the first scientists to start looking at inheritance. And they actually didn't even know what DNA was at the time. All that he noticed was that there were certain things about his plants that when he bred them, they looked different in the offspring. So specifically, he found specific traits, but the one that's in this example here would be color, right? So we've got yellow plant and a green plant. He didn't know this part, right? That didn't exist at his time. All he knew was that he had a yellow plant and a green plant. And when he bred his yellow plants and his green plants, all of his offspring, so all of the new plants, were yellow. Remember, he didn't know this. All he knew was what he could see. So he crossed a yellow and a green, and what he got was all yellow, which didn't make sense to him, right? Because where did the green go? How did the green just disappear? And so he tried playing around with it, and what he did was then he pollinated the offspring. So he pollinated his new yellow plants. And what he found was in the next generation, green showed up again. Not as often as yellow would show up, but green did show up again in the next generation. So it like disappeared and then came back. And so we tried to figure out like how is that possible? How can it go away and come back? And what he figured out was that some traits were stronger than others, right? Yellow is going to show up more often than green is. So what we know now is what he was talking about are what we call alleles. So alleles are variations. Well, I'm actually going to write this in red so it's a little bit more obvious for you guys. Are variations on a gene. Now remember that genes are specific. So you have a gene for eye color. Right? That is, you have one gene that gives you that. Within eye color, you could have blue eyes. That would be an allele. You could have green eyes. That would be a different allele. You could have brown eyes. Oops. That would be an allele. Right? So it's like the different types of that gene that you can have. And what was really important, what Mendel figured out, was there were some traits that were stronger than others. And so what we call that now are dominant traits and recessive traits. So dominant traits are alleles, right? Because we're talking about variations of a gene that will always show up if present. And we show this with a capital letter. So you're going to see in a minute, we actually represent alleles using letters. So if I'm talking about flower color, maybe I'm going to use an F. Right? And so for my dominant trait, I'm going to use a capital F. The letter doesn't really matter, right? The researcher is the one that determines the letter. So if it's not already stated, you kind of have some freedom to pick that. So dominant alleles are shown with a capital, and that kind of shows their dominance, right? They're bigger, they're not better, but stronger. Recessive alleles are alleles that will not appear if a dominant is also there. So we can also say that recessive alleles are only visible if they are the only allele present. And we show them with a lowercase. So an example of flower color, if capital F is my dominant trait, lowercase f would be my recessive trait. Okay, so plant height. Maybe I use an H to mean plant height. My tall plant, if that is dominant, would be shown with a capital H, whereas short would be a lowercase h. Seed color, maybe I use a C. So capital C and lowercase c. And when you're using letters like C's, where your capital and your lowercase look really similar, you need to make it very distinctive that your capital is really big and your lowercase is really small, because we don't want that to be confusing for people that are looking at our letters. So same with shape. If I use an S, you want to make it really clear which one's capital and which one's lowercase. Now I already used C for the seed color, so I need to pick a different letter for pod color. So because one is green and one is yellow, I'm going to pick G. And remember that I picked G, but the one that you pick, the letter doesn't necessarily matter, as long as you make it clear that when I say G, I'm talking about pod color. And so shape, same thing, S is already used, so I'm going to use an I, because it's inflated. Flower position, we'll use A. Right, so capital, lowercase, that's what distinguishes between dominant alleles and recessive alleles. So when it comes to what these alleles actually look like, there's two things to think about when we're talking about inheritance. So the first is the genotype. So your genotype is the genetic buildup of a trait. Now remember that when we're talking about someone's genes, you have two copies, right? So it's the two alleles. Right? So for example, capital B, right? That's two dominant alleles. Capital B lowercase, that's a dominant and a recessive. Lowercase would be two recessives. The other thing that's important for us to recognize is what we call the phenotype. So the phenotype is actually the visible, so it's like the visible representation of the gene. So it's what that gene actually manifests as. So for these guys, for these flowers, purple is a phenotype. So purple versus white, whereas the genotypes would be capital B, capital B, capital B, lowercase b, lowercase b, lowercase b. Right, so these are our genes, what the possible allele combinations are. These are the phenotypes, what that might actually look like. So if we know that pink is dominant to green, remember that means here we're using P's. So pink, being the dominant trait, is going to get the capital letter. Green, because it's not dominant, it has to be recessive, is going to get the lowercase trait, right? Because dominant, recessive. Now remember that we said dominant will always be present, will always be shown if it's present. So here we've got dominant, dominant. If a dominant's present, even one dominant, it's going to look like that. So because pink is dominant, this guy is going to look pink. Dominant, dominant. So here we've got a dominant and a recessive. Now dominants are almost like bullies. If they're there, they show up. They totally overpower the recessive. If a single dominant allele is present, that's what it will look like. So because we have that pink allele, this is going to look pink. That recessive doesn't matter when it comes to this guy's phenotype. We sometimes call those carriers because they have the recessive gene, but it doesn't show up. Now here I've got recessive, recessive. Now recessive alleles, if they are the only thing present, will show up. So here, because there's no dominant present, we're going to see that green. Okay? So let's try horns. So here, not having horns is dominant, right? So that's that capital N. Having horns is recessive. That's that lowercase n. So here, dominant, dominant, it's going to look like the dominant. So we're not going to have horns in that case. Dominant, recessive, as long as one of those dominants is present, it's going to show up. Recessive, recessive. This is the only case where we see that recessive trait coming through. Okay, so it's important to recognize our dominants and our recessives here. So headset eyes are dominant to stalks. Okay, so our headsets are going to be our dominants, and our stalks are going to be our recessives. Dominant, dominant, we're going to see the dominant. Dominant, recessive, remember we only need one dominant. Recessive, recessive, that's the magic where we can finally see that recessive. Tails and aliens are recessive. That means that tails are going to be lowercase. So if we have capitals here, we're not going to see that, right? We only see the recessive quality when it's the only thing present. So this is actually going to not have a tail. Capital T, lowercase t, we only need one dominant for it to block out the recessive, right? Two recessives, that's where we're finally going to see that recessive trait. So recessive dominant is an important distinction to make because we need to know what that, what it's actually going to look like when it's being shown. So we actually have a name for these. We have a name for these different combinations. We have what we call homozygous. The word homo means the same. So a homozygous trait has the same allele twice. So we can have two different kinds of that. Remember, because we have a dominant and a recessive trait. So we can have homozygous dominant. What that means is we have the dominant trait twice. So that would look like two capitals. So, for example, an HH. Homozygous recessive is going to have two lowercase, right? Because we're going to have two of the recessive trait. So, for example, HH. Right? So anytime you have two of the same, it's always going to tell you whether it's homozygous dominant or homozygous recessive. But that homozygous tells us that we have two repeating letters. Heterozygous, hetero means different. So a heterozygous is two different alleles. Now remember, they still have to be the same gene. So you can't have like an A and a B. But you could have a capital and a lowercase a. So what that means is you're going to have one capital and one lowercase. So if we use H as an example, that would be HH. So when it comes to the genotypes, these guys, homozygous dominant, will look like the dominant. Homozygous recessive will look like the recessive, right? Because those are like kind of like purebreds. With our HH, which are mixed, when it comes to the Mendelian inheritance that we're looking at right now, these guys, and this does change. This isn't always going to be true, but for now, with the very basic inheritance that we're looking at, these guys will always look like the dominant, right? Because we have one capital letter, which means it's going to look like that dominant trait. So, two capitals. Are those the same or are they different? They're the same. So that means they are homozygous. So these are homozygous. And because the homozygous, I spelled that wrong. Homozygous. Capitals means this is homozygous dominant. Same or different? Those are different. Different is hetero. Remember, this is different. Homo is the same. So that means that's heterozygous. Same or different? Different. Different is heterozygous. Same or different? The same. That's homozygous. So now with homozygous, we need to differentiate between dominant and recessive. In this case, because they're both capitals, it's going to be homozygous dominant. Same or different? Different. Hetero. Same or different? Different. That's going to be hetero. Same or different? Those are the same. So that's homozygous. And once again, because we have capital letters, that's going to be homozygous dominant. Same or different? Different. It's heterozygous. Heterozygous. Ugh. Different. So we have heterozygous. Now here we have the same again, but this time, oops, not same, we call that homozygous. And this time those are lowercase letters, right? So lowercase letters are going to be recessive. So this is homozygous recessive. And then we have a heterozygous. Okay, so that distinction between the same and different, and this is going to become very important when we start looking at Punnett squares. So for your first assignment, you're just going to be asked to be looking at what is heterozygous, what is homozygous, what is dominant, what is recessive. Then we're going to actually apply that. And I've assigned you a video to look at that because it's a little bit easier when they use their fancy editing software. But essentially, when we look at Punnett squares, we look at what happens if we take someone who is, let's say, homozygous dominant. So we'll take that DD, right? That's one person. And they are going to cross with someone who, let's say, is homozygous recessive. Right? So these are two people. What are the possibilities for their offspring? So remember, when you are inheriting, you're inheriting one from your mother and you're inheriting one from your father. So with this first offspring, there's a chance that it's going to inherit this capital D and this lowercase d. There's also a chance that instead of inheriting this capital D, it inherits this one. Still inheriting that lowercase. In this child, they inherit capital D, lowercase d. And so we do that for all four. These are all of the possibilities for the offspring. So if I'm asked what are the possibilities, in this case, for the genotype, remember for the letters, the only possibility is a capital D and a lowercase d. There's no other options. So for phenotype, what's that going to look like? Oh, we didn't say what D meant. Let's say it means dark hair. We know that the offspring is definitely going to have dark hair. Whereas if instead we had, two heterozygous people, so we had someone, a capital D and a lowercase d crossing with a capital D and a lowercase d, what are their possibilities? Well, we can inherit these guys, right? So I'm just tracking, right? One from the top, one from the side. And if you ever have a capital letter, it's going to come first. What are my possibilities here for genotype? Well, I could have a capital D, a capital D. I could have capital D and a lowercase d. Or I could have two lowercase d's. And for today, it doesn't matter how often those possibilities show up. We're just looking at what are the possibilities. And so same with phenotypes. So remember, big D. So homozygous dominant and heterozygous are going to look the same here, because if we have one of the recessives, or sorry, dominance, it's going to look like that. Now here, though, I also have 2 recessive. So in this case, with this inheritance, there is actually a possibility of having light hair. Even though both of my parents had dark hair. Because they are carriers, there's a possibility that I get it. So that's going to be the second part of your assignment. And you can take a look at the video that I post to get a little bit more of an idea about what you're doing there. Oops.